He's written a book about Jews who, in the finest tradition of their religion, talk truth to power. In this case, criticizing what Israel is doing to Palestinians. Seth is the author of a new book called Radicals, Rabbis and Peacemakers, Conversations with Jewish Critics of Israel. First, I want to ask you a bit about your background. You're from New York?
Yes, I was raised and grew up in New York City. I went to college in University of Wisconsin and got master's in the New School and my doctorate in a school in California in psychology. I thought at the time I was going to be a psychologist, which I was for a while.
And you've written some books in that field.
Yes, my first book was called Madness, Heresy, and the Rumor of Angels, subtitled The Revolt Against the Mental Health System. So it was a critique of the dominant paradigm in psychology and a kind of Foucaultian critique of the way the mental health system works in practice to suppress people.
And did you write another book about psychology, or is there one?
So far I've had 3 books published, numerous articles, and a 4th one that I wrote a few years ago that I'm still waiting to be published. It's supposed to come out this summer.
When did you first really get interested in working on the issue of Israel and Palestine?
In 2002, after the, I use the term deliberately, massacre, the Israeli massacre in Jenin. And although the Israeli government denied it was a massacre, in fact, as you know, the spontaneous reaction of the leader of the Labor Party, Simon Peres, when he first saw Jenin, was, "This is a massacre," and then he took it back. So at that time, I was in the Green Party and found myself writing, demanding that New York State divest from Israel until such time as it end the terrorism. People associate terrorism only with suicide bombings, but I was referring to the state terrorism, the terrorism of the Israeli army at the behest of the state of Israel, and the occupation. And I think it was with all the focus on 9/11 and questioning, at least among people on the left, what it was that led to this hostility toward the American government on the part of the Mideast, that made me aware that certainly one of the main obstacles to any peace, reconciliation between the Western world and the Islamic world was the United States' partiality towards Israel, to the point of not only giving them $3 billion a year, but vetoing, hundreds of resolutions that would have been passed by the Security Council condemning Israeli policies toward the Palestinians.
Now, you're Jewish yourself?
Yes, I'm Jewish.
And a lot of people will be surprised that there would be a Jewish critic of Israel. What was your background? Let's say, what did you learn about Israel growing up?
My parents were secular Jews, so they're agnostics. However, I think for almost every Jew, the state of Israel has taken on some kind of religious significance. So I wasn't, heavily indoctrinated in Zionist ideology, but, every time the topic of Israel would come up, the story was poor little Israel, beleaguered by all these mean, nasty Arab countries, and that I think the Israeli writer Beit Halami, maybe pronouncing his name wrong, said that Americans have a egregious misconception of Israel. And that's one of the reasons why so many Americans naively have such sympathy for Israel. And not only do they see it as the David against the Goliath, but they have this misconception that Israel was a state created by Holocaust survivors themselves. So who could possibly be against Holocaust survivors? Of course, that's not true. It was the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community in America and throughout the diaspora were against the creation of the Israeli state in 1930. It was only after World War II and the Holocaust that there became the majority of Jews became supporters of it. But the state of Israel would not have come into existence without a group of one might call rabid Zionists who believed in the Zionist doctrine, just as Lenin or Stalin believed in the Bolshevik doctrine. I mean, it was a particular ideology. It was not seen at the time as representing the interest of all Jews.
Though nowadays, when people criticize Zionism, the Jewish establishment claims they're anti-Semitic.
Yeah, they've as Norman Finkelstein points out in his book, The Holocaust Industry, the people now, for example, neocons, well-known neoconservatives like Norman Podhoretz, that's one example. In his book, Making It, in which he used to be a liberal. He went to Columbia in the 50s, as you know. Yeah, he was a classmate of Allen Ginsberg. And the Commentary was a liberal magazine and an irreverent magazine, and many articles it published. For example, it published Hannah Arendt in the mid-40s article, very critical of Israel. But and Podhoretz, in his first book, Making It, I don't know if it's his first book, but it's his first well-known book, in which he says, well, who cares about ethics anymore? My real secret is I want to be famous. I want to have a lot of money. And he's pretty frank about that. He mentions Israel maybe once or twice. After 1967, when Israel, quote-unquote, kicked ass of the Arab states, all of a sudden there was many intellectuals who became enamored of Israel. It became an object of religious adoration. As some people have said, the idea, the Jewish God was replaced by the Jewish state, and what gave it its numinosity was its military power, and this also made it attractive to the United States, and you had a whole. What then grew up was even Podhoretz himself said that Israel had become a religion. You had a whole group of American Jewish power brokers who saw their own identity as representing the state of Israel to America. And I dissent from that religion. I in actuality, I'm somewhat quaint in that I actually believe in God. And I'm inspired, as I think many Jews are, by the writings of Isaiah, Amos, and the prophets. And the prophets, as many Jewish intellectuals pointed out, the anti-Zionist rabbi Yeshua Lebowitz, maybe mispronouncing his name, from the point of view of secular nationalism, the prophets were traitors. But it's really odd because Americans, including American Jews, are a liberal group, and they have generally, compared to the rest, they have no hesitation about criticizing America and making the point that the American government and the American state does not represent the American people. It certainly does not represent what should be cherished about America, the virtuous qualities of America, the aesthetic qualities of America. And as a Jew, the same could be said about Israel. It does not represent the Jewish people. It represents a particular faction that claims that wants to maintain their own power as heads of the Jewish state, and claims it's in the interests of Jews all over to support this militaristic leviathan that is agitating and keeps simmering a conflict between the Arabs and the Palestinians and the Jews. I agree with Mark Ellis that in order to be faithful to the Jewish covenant itself, our obligation to God, which entails our adherence to universal norms, universal ethical norms that apply, not just tribalistic norms that my group of Jews is going to beat your group of Catholics, but we Jews will fight for justice for all people. In order to be faithful to Judaism, I have to oppose the state of Israel.
In our last few minutes, let's talk about the book you wrote, Radicals, Rabbis and Peacemakers. You're the editor of it. Did you interview all these people, or?
Yes, and I should say, in what I just said now, not all of them would agree with me. Oh, they're all critics of Israel, but not all of them would agree with me that fidelity to what it means to be a Jew requires that they speak out against Israel. Some would, some wouldn't.
Who are some of the people in the book?
Noam Chomsky, Joel Kovel, Norman Finkelstein, Adam Shapiro, who people may or may not know was denounced on the, I think it was on the front page in the New York Post as the Jewish Taliban, because he had devoted, Adam is a nonviolent activist in the International Solidarity Movement, the same movement that Rachel Corrie was in when she was murdered by the Israeli army. And Adam risked his life a number of times. And despite the claim of the New York Post that Adam was a fan of Arafat, in my interview with him, he's very critical of Arafat. He was a supporter of the rights of the Palestinian people, which are guaranteed by international law. So, and Phyllis Bennis, and I also interviewed a rabbi who's in Netorah Kartai, an Orthodox group that is opposed to political Zionism, meaning a Jewish state in which Arabs or non-Jews have second class or third class or fourth class rights. And
you interviewed Ora Weiss from JADO?
Yeah.
Tell us about JADO.
I know her. JADO was, I think, founded in 2000. I joined it in 2002, and it's a group of very committed people. Most of them, not all of them, but the majority of them seem to be in their 20s. And
it stands for, what does JADO stand for?
Jews Against the Occupation. I think if you wanted to look it up in the JADO group on the website, it would be www.jado.nyc, jadonyc.org. And one of the principles they affirm, unlike many other Jewish groups, is the right of return for Palestinians, not to be confused with the law of return, which is an apartheid and a racist law, I believe. The right of return, which was guaranteed to the refugees in 1949 by the United Nations. So the people in JADO feel, as I feel, that in a struggle for social justice, and you can quote any of the Jewish prophets, which one was it that said, the work of justice will bring peace. I've been to many demonstrations where they chant, no justice, no peace. That, in fact, is also the position of the Jewish prophets. And I believe it's also the position of everyone I interviewed in my book, whether they care, whether they read the Jewish. Adam himself Adam Shapiro is an atheist, and he doesn't even consider himself Jewish, because he considers Judaism a religion, and as an atheist, he didn't consider himself Judaism. So everyone in JADO, as opposed to many of the other groups that say, we love Israel, blah, 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 we don't feel any great affinity toward Israel. We feel a sympathy toward Jews all over the world. But right now we feel, and I speak for other people in JADO, I don't think I'm being presumptuous, that our main commitment is to the Palestinians, because they are being oppressed by our people in our name. They are living in refugee camps in conditions of squalor. They are subject to continual harassment by the Israeli state and the Israeli army, and what could only be construed as an attempted act of ethnic cleansing to make their life so miserable that they flee from Palestine itself. And it's also an act of state terrorism that's in violation of international law, as declared by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the British, not the British, the Israeli Human Rights Group at Salam.
Well, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you.